Good morning, Hank. It's Tuesday. So my book, Everything is Tuberculosis, has been on the New York Times bestseller list for 14 consecutive weeks, which is astonishing to me. That's twice as long as my previous book, The Anthropocene Reviewed, was on the bestseller list, and this is a book about tuberculosis. So it's wonderful to know that Everything is TB is continuing to find so many readers, but what does that actually mean? What does it mean to be a New York Times bestseller? Does that mean you're selling 12 books a week, 1,200, 12,000? Well, it depends. So first off, Everything is Tuberculosis is called a #1 New York Times bestseller because for the first couple weeks after its release, it was the #1 best-selling nonfiction book in the United States, at least according to the obscure and somewhat opaque tabulations of the New York Times, which involve asking lots of bookstores weighted toward independent ones what's selling each week. Everything is Tuberculosis was almost guaranteed to be a #1 New York Times bestseller because I signed over 100,000 copies of the first printing, and also a ton of people pre-ordered it, like 50,000, and if you sell 50,000 books in a single week, you're almost guaranteed to be a #1 New York Times bestseller, unless you're up against something like The Hunger Games. But I wasn't up against The Hunger Games, even though the new Hunger Games book came out the same day as mine, because that book is fiction for kids, whereas my book is nonfiction for adults. And there is more than one New York Times bestseller list. There's the nonfiction list, but there's also the advice, how-to, and miscellaneous list, and graphic novel lists, and audiobook lists, and so on. So actually, just this week, there are 15 different #1 New York Times bestsellers, and some of those books sell 7,000 or 8,000 copies in a week. I think the Hunger Games book sold 750,000 copies in a week. So #1 New York Times bestseller doesn't actually tell you that much about sales. What it tells you is sales relative to its category. And over the course of a year, there will be hundreds of different #1 New York Times bestsellers, so you might think of it as a kind of unimpressive accomplishment. Like you might go to Walmart and see that almost every book there says #1 New York Times bestseller, but it's important to remember almost no books end up in Walmart. About 85% of traditionally published books, like books published by big publishers, sell fewer than 5,000 copies, and only about 0.4% sell more than 100,000. My first novel, Looking for Alaska, was widely reviewed and won a major award and never came anywhere close to the New York Times bestseller list, at least not until the success of The Fault in Our Stars many years later. So just to be clear, the vast, vast majority of books published by major publishers don't become New York Times bestsellers. And even for those that do, while New York Times bestseller is certainly a career milestone and an important designation, it isn't necessarily life-changing money. I first reached the New York Times bestseller list with my third novel, Paper Towns, which spent 3 weeks on the young adult hardcover list and sold about 20,000 copies during those 3 weeks. Now that's a lot of books, and it meant I made a lot of money in those 3 weeks, but then it fell off the list, and in total, the hardcover of Paper Towns made around $105,000, which again is a lot of money, but it did take 3 years to write the book, so that was about $35,000 a year. Now listen, that's a modest living just from writing, which is incredible, but it might be less than you expect from the phrase New York Times bestseller. Sometimes New York Times bestsellers involve selling 10,000 copies a week for 200 weeks in a row, in which case you become quite wealthy. Sometimes it involves selling 1,500 copies a week for 1 week, in which case you don't. Then there's the famous quirkiness of the New York Times list itself. Books that objectively should be on the list sometimes aren't, either because they don't sell well at independent bookstores or because they were published too long ago, or for obscure reasons that no one understands. If you really want to see what's selling overall each week, the USA Today list combines all books and gives you a pretty good sense of where things are. On that list, Everything is Tuberculosis is number 80 right now. Whereas on the New York Times nonfiction list, it's number 6. Now, to be fair to the New York Times, only 5 of those 79 books that are in front of Everything is Tuberculosis would be considered for the nonfiction list, so it's actually pretty accurate in that way, but that's not always the case. Also, there are other lists like the Independent Booksellers bestseller list, where right now Everything is Tuberculosis is number 2, which reminds me, thank you, independent bookstores. And speaking of independent bookstores, if you only read New York Times bestsellers, you're missing out on a lot of the breadth and quality of books in the world today. My favorite way to read is to get recommendations from booksellers and librarians and other people who've read a lot more than I ever will. That's how I've discovered some of my favorite books. I didn't find out about Paul Beatty's Tough or Maureen Johnson's early books because they were bestsellers. I found out about them because they were recommended to me by librarians and booksellers. And some of my favorite books are among those 85% that sold fewer than 5,000 copies. So at the risk of undermining my own career, I really encourage you to read both on and off the bestseller list. I've tried to answer most of the questions I commonly get about the New York Times bestseller list, but if you have more, leave them in comments and I'll try to be there. Hank, I'll see you on Friday.